In the early 1930s, airlines were in a knife fight for passengers. Boeing had just rolled out the Model 247, a fast, all-metal twin-engine airliner that could outrun most military planes of the day. It was efficient and gave Boeing's own airline, United, a massive advantage. Competitors like TWA suddenly looked outdated, flying slower tri-motors that belonged in another era. TWA's president, Jack Fry, wasn't about to sit back and watch his airline die. Alongside his trusted lieutenant, Paul E. Richter, Jr., Fry went straight to Douglas Aircraft with a challenge. Build us something that can beat the 247. Faster, safer, more comfortable, and powerful enough to keep climbing even if one engine quit at altitude. It was a tall order. Airliners of the day could have speed, or altitude, or range, but not all three. Fry demanded them all at once. Donald Douglas, still running a relatively small company out of California, could have turned it down. Instead, he handed the task to a young engineering team with a reputation for bold ideas. Their response wouldn't just match Boeing, it would leapfrog them. And what they came up with, unlike anything the world had ever seen, was about to change the balance of power in the skies. The airplane that would become the DC-1 emerged from blueprint to reality in the summer of 1933. After months of feverish work inside Douglas's Santa Monica plant, the prototype rolled out on June 22 of that year. Workers, engineers, and executives all gathered around the polished aluminum machine, a low-wing monoplane with twin Pratt & Whitney Hornet engines nestled under its wings. Compared to the noisy tri-motors it was meant to replace, the DC-1 looked like it had arrived from another decade. Douglas put its most trusted test crew in the cockpit: Chief Test Pilot Carl Anson Cover and Flight Engineer Fred Herman. On July 1, 1933, at Clover Field in Santa Monica, the pair throttled up the twin engines and lifted off for the very first time. Crowds on the ground watched the silver airplane climb away, smooth, steady, and faster than anything the airline world had yet seen. The flight, though, was not without drama. Minutes into testing, both engines cut out simultaneously, forcing Cover to improvise. The cause was traced not to faulty engines, but to human error. The carburetors had been installed backwards. It was the kind of mistake that could have ended the program before it began. But Cover, calm under pressure, glided the DC-1 safely back to the airfield. For Douglas, it was a reminder that this wasn't just another airplane. It was a machine on the cutting edge where even the smallest detail mattered. Once the carburetor issue was fixed, the DC-1 revealed its true character. It cruised faster than the Boeing 247, climbed more confidently on a single engine, and carried more passengers with greater comfort. Its monocoque fuselage, an all-metal stressed skin design, was not only stronger than fabric-covered aircraft, but also gave passengers a quieter, smoother ride. For airlines that had been flying converted military bombers or lumbering trimotors, the difference was night and day. But even beyond performance, the DC-1 represented a shift in philosophy. Airplanes up to this point were usually designed as standalone projects. The DC-1, however, was envisioned from the start as the beginning of a family. Jack Fry and TWA executives pressed for modifications: more seats, more range, more reliability. Douglas's engineers listened, knowing that the real prize wouldn't be this one prototype, it would be what came next. The DC-1 was more than a test bed. It was a proof of concept. In just over 6 months of evaluation flights, it convinced both the airlines and the Army Air Corps that all-metal airliners had finally come of age. Other companies had experimented with similar designs, but none had put it all together quite like this. And with every test flight logged by Cover and Herman, the prototype opened doors to ideas the industry hadn't dared to pursue. This wasn't the airplane that would conquer the world, but without it, the airplane that did wouldn't have existed. In 1934, the single DC-1 was no longer just a prototype parked on the tarmac. It was suddenly front-page news. Western Air Express, eager to showcase the future of flying, gave the aircraft a grand name: the City of Los Angeles. And this lone machine was about to prove what no plane in America had accomplished before, that air travel could outrun the railroads. The challenge came in the form of a transcontinental dash. At the controls was Jack Fry, a pilot with nerves of steel and the vision of an airline executive who believed aviation could outpace the dominance of Pullman trains. Alongside him was Cy Morehouse, Western Air Express's general manager, determined to turn publicity into paying passengers. Joining them were two men whose names gave the flight instant credibility: Paul Richter, one of the airline's co-founders, and none other than Eddie Rickenbacker, America's most celebrated ace of World War I, now a leading figure in commercial aviation. Together, they flew the DC-1 across the continent, cutting hours off the previous benchmarks. The numbers stunned the press. New York to Los Angeles in just over 13 hours of flying time, spread across fuel stops. For the traveling public who were used to days on the rails, this was closer to magic than machinery. Newspapers marveled not only at the speed, but at the comfort. Passengers could sit in plush seats, enjoy meals in flight, and arrive rested instead of battered. Suddenly, the old assumptions about rail supremacy crumbled. The DC-1 had shown that airlines weren't just mail carriers or novelty services for the rich. They could now offer practical, reliable, and fast transportation across the United States. Rickenbacker himself remarked afterward that this aircraft represented the future of travel, a powerful endorsement from a man whose voice carried enormous weight in aviation circles. Yet while the record flights dazzled the public and cemented the Douglas name in aviation history, the DC-1 was still just one airplane. Behind the scenes, Donald Douglas and his engineers were already sketching ways to improve it, stretching the fuselage, adding seats, and boosting performance. In other words, the DC-1 was doing its job not as a production aircraft, but as a blueprint for what came next. And what came next would be the DC-2, a machine that turned aviation into big business. But even as the headlines celebrated the city of Los Angeles, a quieter question began to emerge among insiders. If the DC-1 was such a triumph, why would Douglas never build a second one?
In February 1934, aviation in America ran headfirst into politics. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, newly in office, abruptly canceled all private airmail contracts. His administration accused airlines of profiteering and collusion in securing lucrative government mail routes. Overnight, commercial carriers were grounded, their contracts stripped away. The mail, however, still had to move. Roosevelt ordered the U.S. Army Air Corps to take over delivery. On paper, it looked like a patriotic solution. In practice, it was a disaster. Army pilots were brave, but poorly prepared for the brutal conditions of long-distance night flying in storms and across mountains. They had little instrument training, flew outdated biplanes, and were suddenly tasked with covering routes designed for faster, safer commercial machines. Within weeks, the skies turned tragic. Dozens of Army aviators were lost in accidents, their planes smashed into hillsides or buried in blizzards. The public recoiled at the headlines, blaming the administration's decision and demanding a return to private carriers. Airlines seized the moment to prove that commercial aviation wasn't just a business, it was a necessity. Western Air Express rolled out the DC-1, showing reporters and government officials what modern technology could do compared to the fragile military biplanes then in service. The city of Los Angeles wasn't just a publicity tool anymore, it became a protest symbol, a flying demonstration of why commercial carriers were safer, faster, and more reliable. Roosevelt eventually backed down, restoring mail contracts to airlines later that year. But by then, the damage had already been done. The crisis had shown the American public and Congress that aviation was no longer in its infancy. It was becoming indispensable to the nation's infrastructure. And while politics raged in Washington, something more important was unfolding quietly at Douglas's Santa Monica plant. Engineers weren't just resting on the DC-1's reputation. They were already deep into building its successor, a machine that would turn one promising prototype into an empire. By late 1934, it was clear that one prototype wouldn't be enough. The DC-1 had shown the world what was possible, but airlines wanted more seats, more range, and more durability. At Transcontinental and Western Air, TWA, executives like Jack Fry and Paul Richter pushed Douglas hard, a plane that could carry not just a dozen passengers, but closer to 14 without sacrificing speed or safety. Douglas's design team, led by Arthur Raymond, listened carefully. They took what worked from the DC-1's all-metal low-wing design and scaled it up. The fuselage was lengthened, the wing area expanded, and more powerful Wright Cyclone engines were bolted on. What emerged in 1934 was the DC-2, a plane that looked like its predecessor at a glance, but was built for real airline schedules and passengers who demanded comfort along with speed. The timing couldn't have been sharper. The airmail crisis had shaken public trust in Washington, but it opened the door for airlines to reassert their value. The DC-2 became their proof. Suddenly, flights weren't just about covering distance. They were about doing it in modern, streamlined machines that rivaled trains for coast-to-coast prestige. This was exactly the kind of momentum Douglas needed to pull ahead of competitors like Boeing's 247, which just months earlier had looked unbeatable. But the DC-2 wasn't only about keeping up with the competition. It was about setting new standards. In October 1934, one of the very first DC-2s entered the McRobertson Air Race, a grueling course from England to Australia. Piloted by K.L. Parmentier and J.J. Maul, the KLM aircraft finished not only as the fastest airliner in the contest, but third overall, behind only two purpose-built racing planes. It was a stunning demonstration that a commercial airliner could cross continents and oceans with speed and reliability once reserved for military machines. That moment made headlines worldwide. Airlines in Europe and Asia took notice, and suddenly, Douglas wasn't just an American manufacturer, it was a global player. The DC-2 wasn't the endgame, though. Even as orders rolled in, conversations inside Douglas circled back to the same problem: capacity. If airlines wanted to finally beat the trains for good, they needed something bigger still. The DC-3, the legend born from the prototype. By 1935, the DC-2 was a proven success, but airlines were already pushing for more. None more than C.R. Smith, the hard-driving president of American Airlines. Smith wanted something no one else dared ask for, a plane that could carry passengers in real beds, offering overnight comfort on transcontinental flights. Douglas's engineers, led by Arthur Raymond and guided by Smith's demands, took the DC-2 and stretched its possibilities further than anyone imagined. The result was the Douglas Sleeper Transport, quickly refined into the DC-3. Larger fuselage, more powerful Pratt & Whitney Twin Wasp engines, greater range, and seating for over 20 passengers in standard daytime configuration. It wasn't just an upgrade, it was a leap forward. Airlines loved it, passengers adored it, and soon the DC-3 was flying with American Airlines, United, Eastern, Delta, and TWA, setting a new global benchmark for commercial aviation. The DC-3 wasn't the gold standard, it became the sky itself. During its peak, more than 90% of U.S. airline passengers were flying on DC-3s. Pilots called it forgiving, passengers called it smooth, and competitors quietly admitted it had ended the race. But while the DC-3 became the queen of the skies, the lone DC-1 quietly disappeared into history, on a journey few remember today.
After its record flights and role as a symbol during the airmail crisis, the original DC-1 had already proven its worth. But Douglas had no intention of producing more. All focus had shifted to the DC-2 and then the DC-3. That left just one question: what to do with the prototype? The first stop was the U.S. government, which acquired the DC-1 for high-altitude research. It carried scientists and equipment into thinner skies, helping unlock the data that would shape future aviation. Then came one of the most colorful figures in American aviation, Howard Hughes. Always hungry for cutting-edge aircraft, Hughes briefly acquired the DC-1 before passing it on to Viscount Forbes in the United Kingdom, where it was registered as GAFIIF and flew for European operators. The DC-1 then crossed borders again, this time into France, where it worked under various operators, still proving itself as a reliable machine, even as war clouds gathered over Europe. Finally, it ended up in the hands of the Spanish Republican airline, LAPE, during the Spanish Civil War. The prototype that had once dazzled American passengers now carried out urgent missions in a country torn apart by conflict. Its end came in December 1940, when the aircraft was forced to land at Malaga, Spain. It was damaged beyond repair and written off. The only DC-1 was gone forever. Yet it was never truly lost. Its DNA lived on in the DC-2, and most famously in the DC-3, a plane so enduring that many still fly today, nearly a century later. If you've made it this far and you love stories of aviation's forgotten legends, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey into the skies.